There are some loads you never forget, and Unit 47 was one of them. My name is Vincent Reyes, and I've been driving transport for Evergreen Memorial Services for 8 years now. It's quiet, work mostly, just me, the hearse, and the silence between pickup and delivery. I've carried thousands of people to their final rest, and in all that time, I've learned to read the weight of grief, how a casket feels different when the family's watching, how the van handles when it's carrying someone who died young versus someone who lived a full life. But Unit 47 broke all those rules. I first picked it up on a Tuesday morning in late September of 2023. Beautiful mahogany piece, solid brass handles, the kind of casket that spoke of respect and considerable expense. The work order said pickup from Evergreen's main facility, delivery to Hillcrest Cemetery, Plot 719C, standard graveside service at 2 in the afternoon. I'd loaded similar caskets hundreds of times before, knew exactly how they'd settle in the van's cargo area, how they'd shift slightly on turns. The drive to Hillcrest took 43 minutes through autumn traffic. The casket rode perfectly centered, stable, the weight distributed exactly as it should be. I remember thinking about how the family had chosen well. The mahogany had this warm grain that caught the morning light streaming through the van's rear windows. At the cemetery, the pallbearers were professional, respectful. They carried their burden with the careful dignity that families pay good money to see. I watched from a distance as they lowered Unit 47 into the earth, watched the first shovelfuls of soil disappear into that rectangular darkness. The return trip started normally. I'd cleaned the van, secured the loading equipment, and pulled away from Hillcrest just after 3:30. But somewhere on Maple Avenue, about 15 minutes into the drive back, I felt it. A shift in the van's handling. Subtle at first, like when you're carrying an uneven load and something settles wrong. I checked my mirrors, thinking maybe I'd left a piece of equipment unsecured, but the cargo area was empty. That's when I noticed the weight. The van was riding heavy in the rear, heavier than it should have been with nothing back there but air and shadows. I pulled over at a gas station, walked around to the back, and opened the doors. Nothing. Just the empty space where Unit 47 had ridden an hour earlier. But when I got back behind the wheel, the feeling persisted. The van pulled slightly to the right, the way it did when I was carrying a full load. I drove the rest of the way back to Evergreen, telling myself it was my imagination. But the following Tuesday, I had Unit 47 again. Same mahogany casket, same brass handles, same work order. Pickup from Evergreen, delivery to Hillcrest, Plot 719C. I checked the paperwork twice, thinking there'd been some mistake. Maybe the family had decided on a different casket, or there'd been an issue with the burial. But everything looked correct. The weight felt normal on the way there, standard load, standard handling. The return trip was different. This time, the weight shift happened earlier, just as I was leaving the cemetery gates, and it was stronger. The van's rear end dipped noticeably, like I was carrying something dense and heavy. I could feel it in the steering, the way the vehicle wanted to drift. But more disturbing was how the weight seemed to move. On left turns, it would shift toward the passenger side. On right turns, it moved the other way. But on straight stretches, it always settled toward the front of the cargo area, always toward where the head of the casket would rest. I started paying closer attention after that. Every Tuesday, without fail, I'd get the call for Unit 47. Same pickup, same delivery, same route to Plot 719C. The outbound trips were always normal. The returns were always wrong. By the 5th week, I could predict exactly when the weight would manifest. Just past the cemetery gates, maybe a quarter-mile down Hillcrest Road. First, a subtle change in how the van handled. Then, that unmistakable sense of carrying something heavy. Something that shifted and settled like a person might shift and settle, trying to find a comfortable position for a long ride. I started timing it. The weight would appear at 3:47 in the afternoon and persist until I reached the funeral home, exactly 43 minutes later. I tried different routes, thinking maybe it was related to road conditions or traffic patterns. Didn't matter. Highway or surface streets, the weight stayed consistent, always there, always shifting toward the head. On the 7th Tuesday, I decided to talk to someone. Director Chen was in her office when I knocked, reviewing service schedules for the following week. She looked up from her paperwork with that practiced expression of professional concern that funeral directors master after years in the business. "Vincent," she said, "everything all right?" I sat down across from her desk, trying to figure out how to explain something that sounded impossible even to me. "It's about Unit 47, I said finally. "The Tuesday runs to Hillcrest." Her expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes. A recognition, maybe, or a wariness. "What about it?" "The casket feels different on the way back," I said. "Heavier, like there's still something in the van." Director Chen set down her pen and looked at me for a long moment. Outside her office window, the afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across the parking lot where the hearses sat in neat rows. "Vincent," she said quietly, "we buried that one empty." The words hit me like cold water. "What do you mean, empty?" "The family changed their mind at the last minute," she said, "decided on cremation instead. But the plot was already paid for, the service scheduled. Rather than cancel everything and refund the cemetery fees, they asked us to proceed with a symbolic burial. The casket you've been transporting every Tuesday contains nothing but satin lining and brass fixtures." I sat there, processing what she'd told me. 8 weeks of feeling that weight, that presence shifting in the cargo area behind me. 8 weeks of something riding along on every return trip from Hillcrest Cemetery. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. "Because it shouldn't matter," she said. "An empty casket should feel like an empty casket." Should, but didn't. That night, I went home and sat in my kitchen, staring out at the darkness beyond my window. I thought about all those Tuesday drives, all those times I'd felt something settling behind me, shifting like a passenger trying to get comfortable for the long ride home. I thought about Plot 719C and wondered what was supposed to be resting there in that expensive mahogany box, surrounded by all that empty satin. The next Tuesday, I called in sick. And the Tuesday after that, I haven't driven transport for Evergreen Memorial Services since October of 2023. Found work with a medical supply company insta-delivering wheelchairs and oxygen tanks to nursing homes. Lighter loads. No passengers. But sometimes, on Tuesday afternoons around 3:47, I'll be driving down some random street and feel my car dip slightly in the rear. Feel that familiar shift in the handling, that sense of carrying something heavier than what should be there. When it happens, I check my mirrors and see nothing but empty back seat and afternoon sunlight. I never look too closely, though, because I'm afraid of what might be settling in behind me, trying to find the most comfortable position for whatever journey we're taking together. Some loads, once they choose you, never really let go. And every Tuesday, somewhere in this city, Unit 47 is still making its rounds. Some nights, the dead are more restless than the living. My name is Margaret Hendricks, and I've been working night security at Eternal Rest Funeral Home for 8 years. It's solitary work, just me, the monitors, and the quiet that settles over a building full of people who'll never speak again. Most folks think it would be creepy, watching over the dead all night. But honestly, it's the living who cause most of the problems. Break-ins, vandalism, the occasional drunk who wanders in thinking we're still open. The deceased are usually the most well-behaved residents I've ever had to watch over. The funeral home sits on Elm Street, in what used to be a residential neighborhood, a converted Victorian mansion with high ceilings and crown molding that gives the place a dignity most modern facilities can't match. My station is in what used to be the library, surrounded by monitors showing feeds from 12 cameras positioned throughout the building. Parlor A, Parlor B, the main corridor, the preparation rooms, the loading dock. I know every angle, every shadow, every way the light falls through the stained glass windows when the street lamps hit them just right. I work the midnight to 8 shift, Sunday through Thursday. During those hours, I'm the only living person in a building that usually houses between 3 and 8 others, depending on the week's services. My job is simple: watch the feeds, log any unusual activity, and call the police if someone tries to break in. In 8 years, I've had maybe a dozen incidents worth reporting. Mostly kids on dares, trying to sneak around back. The kind of thing that makes for good stories, but not much actual danger. The night I first noticed him was a Tuesday in mid-October of 2024. 3 viewings scheduled for the week. An elderly woman in Parlor A, a middle-aged man in Parlor B, and a teenage girl in the smaller viewing room down the hall. Standard setup, nothing unusual about the arrangements or the families. I'd watched the last visitors leave around 9:30, had seen Director Williams lock up and head home. By midnight, when I started my shift, the building had settled into its familiar quiet. I was reading a paperback mystery around 2 in the morning when something on the Parlor B monitor caught my eye. Just a flicker of movement, the kind that makes you look up even when you're not sure why. The gentleman laid out there, Mr. Holloway, according to the nameplate by his casket, was wearing a dark suit with a burgundy tie. Nice outfit. The kind of thing that spoke of a man who'd taken pride in his appearance. But something about his tie looked wrong. It was crooked. Not dramatically, just slightly askew, the way a tie gets when someone's been moving around and hasn't had a chance to adjust it. I stared at the monitor for a long moment, trying to remember if it had been like that earlier. During my 11 o'clock walkthrough, everything had looked perfect. The funeral home staff took pride in their presentation. They'd never leave someone looking disheveled for viewing. I made a note in my log. 2:07 a.m. Checked Parlor B. Tie appears slightly crooked. Then I went back to my book. An hour later, I glanced at the monitor again. The tie was straight. Not just straight, perfectly centered. The knot positioned exactly as it should be. I rewound the footage, scanning back through the previous hour, but the camera angle only showed Mr. Holloway from the chest up, and the image quality wasn't sharp enough to catch subtle movements. Still, I was certain the tie had been crooked when I'd looked before. The next night, I paid closer attention. Same setup, same viewing schedule. Mr. Holloway's service was set for Thursday afternoon, so he'd be there for 2 more nights. This time, I started watching the Parlor B feed more regularly, checking it every 30 minutes or so. At 2:15, the tie was crooked again. Same angle, slightly to the left. At 2:45, it was straight. At 3:20, crooked. At 3:50, straight. I began timing it. The pattern wasn't random. The tie would shift out of alignment somewhere between 2 and 4 in the morning, always during the quietest hours, when even the street outside was still. Then, somehow, it would correct itself. I tried adjusting the camera angle, thinking maybe it was a trick of the lighting or shadows cast by the flowers surrounding the casket. But no matter how I positioned the monitor, the pattern continued. On Thursday night, Mr. Holloway's final night before his service, I decided to see it happen. I set up in the main corridor with a clear view down the hall to Parlor B. The lights were dimmed, but not completely off. We kept enough illumination for safety and security. From my position, I could see the casket clearly, could make out Mr. Holloway's profile and the burgundy tie at his throat. At 2:33 in the morning, I watched him lift his right hand to his collar. It was a small movement, natural and practiced, the way a man adjusts his tie dozens of times throughout his life. His fingers found the knot, made a subtle correction to the alignment, and then settled back into place at his side. The gesture took maybe 3 seconds. Quiet, careful, unconscious. The kind of thing you do without thinking when you want to look presentable. I stood there in that hallway, watching a dead man straighten his tie, and felt something cold settle in my chest. Not fear, exactly more like recognition. The understanding that I'd witnessed something that shouldn't exist but did, something that made perfect sense and no sense at all. I checked my watch. 2:34 a.m. In an hour and 16 minutes, Mr. Holloway would adjust his tie again. And sometime after that, when the morning light started filtering through the stained glass windows and Director Williams arrived to prepare for the day's services, the tie would be perfectly straight. Ready for the family. Ready for goodbye. I didn't report it. Didn't write it in my log. Didn't mention it to anyone on the day shift. How do you explain watching a corpse fix his appearance? How do you tell people that the dead still care about looking their best? But I kept watching. Every night I worked after that, I'd check on whoever was lying in the viewing parlors. Mrs. Chen in Parlor A straightened the sleeves of her dress. Young Tommy Morrison in the small viewing room kept brushing imaginary lint off his jacket. Mr. Garrett reached up periodically to smooth his hair, the way someone does when they're nervous about making a good impression. Always between 2 and 4 in the morning. Always small, careful adjustments. Always exactly the kind of thing they'd probably done countless times in life. I realized they were getting ready. In those quiet hours, when no one was watching except for one tired security guard, they were preparing themselves for the people who would come to say goodbye. Making sure they looked their best for the final viewing, the last chance their loved ones would have to see them whole and peaceful. It's been 3 months since that first night with Mr. Holloway, and I still see it happen. Not every night, not with everyone, but often enough that I've stopped being surprised. I think of it as their final act of courtesy, their last gift to the people they're leaving behind. The dead, it turns out, are more considerate than most of the living I know. But sometimes, late at night when I'm watching those monitors, I wonder if they know I'm there, if they can sense someone witnessing their private moments of preparation. And I wonder what they might think of the living woman who spends her nights watching over them, making sure they're safe while they get ready for their last and most important appointment. I never look too closely at the monitors now during those early morning hours. Some things, I've learned, are meant to be done in private. There are mysteries in this world that prayer cannot solve, only witness. My name is Father Samuel Reeves, and I've served as chaplain at Greenwood Memorial Cemetery for 14 years. It's peaceful work, mostly conducting graveside services, offering comfort to grieving families, and maintaining the small chapel that sits at the heart of our 120-acre grounds. I walk these pathways every day, past monuments that tell the stories of lives lived and loved, past flowers that mark continuing devotion from those left behind. In all my years here, I've grown familiar with the rhythms of grief, how fresh flowers appear on certain graves every Sunday without fail, how some headstones accumulate small treasure coins, photographs, children's drawings, sealed in plastic bags. How the seasons change the landscape, but never change the fact that love persists beyond death, manifesting in these small, tender rituals of remembrance. The cemetery operates on a schedule as reliable as morning prayers. The grounds crew arrives at 7, the office opens at 8:30, and families begin their visits shortly after. I conduct my evening prayers in the chapel every day at 6, when the light is soft and golden, and the day's visitors have mostly returned to their own lives. It's during these quiet hours that I've learned to read the subtle language of this place, which graves are tended regularly, which have been forgotten, which carry the weight of complicated grief. Mrs. Chen's grave has always been one of the most carefully maintained in Section C. She passed in late spring of 2023, and her family established an immediate pattern of devotion that impressed even me. Every Sunday morning, without exception, someone would arrive with a fresh arrangement of white roses. Always white, always roses, always placed in the bronze vase that stood at the base of her headstone. The arrangement was generous but tasteful. 24 long-stemmed roses, arranged with baby's breath and greenery, the kind of display that spoke of both love and financial means. I noticed the pattern of decay by midsummer. While other flowers on nearby graves would wilt naturally over the course of a week, browning at the edges, dropping petals, gradually returning to earth in the way flowers, Mrs. Chen's roses, behave differently. They would look perfect for the first 2 days after placement, fresh, vibrant, exactly as they'd appeared when first delivered. But by the 3rd day, something would change. The white petals would begin to darken, not brown or yellow, as flowers normally do when they age, but black. Deep, rich black, as if someone had taken a brush dipped in India ink and painted each petal with careful precision. By the end of that 3rd day, the entire arrangement would have transformed from pristine white to funeral black, still maintaining its shape and structure, but completely altered in character. At first, I assumed it was some kind of vandalism, perhaps someone with a grudge against the family, or teenagers playing pranks in the cemetery after hours. I started paying closer attention, walking past Mrs. Chen's grave multiple times each day, looking for signs of interference. But the transformation always happened during the daylight hours, when the cemetery was open and occupied. If someone was deliberately blackening the flowers, they were doing it in plain sight of potential witnesses. I began documenting the phenomenon in late July. Each Sunday, I would photograph the fresh white roses immediately after they were delivered. Then, I'd return each day to document their progression, creating a visual record of something that seemed to defy natural explanation. The photographs told a story that made no sense. Flowers maintaining their structural integrity while completely changing color in a way that no botanical process could account for. The family continued their weekly visits, seemingly unaware of the transformation their flowers underwent. They would arrive each Sunday morning, remove the blackened roses from the previous week, and replace them with fresh white ones. I wanted to ask them if they'd noticed the pattern, but approaching grieving families with questions about supernatural flower behavior seemed both inappropriate and potentially distressing. By August, other cemetery visitors had begun to notice. I would occasionally overhear whispered conversations near Section C, families pointing toward Mrs. Chen's grave and commenting on the strange black flowers. Some crossed themselves. Others hurried past, pulling their children along more quickly than necessary. But no one seemed to connect the black roses with the white ones that appeared fresh every Sunday. I decided to involve the security system. Greenwood Memorial had installed cameras throughout the grounds in 2022, primarily to prevent vandalism and monitor for after-hours trespassers. I approached the cemetery director about reviewing footage from the camera that covered Section C, explaining that I was concerned about possible interference with grave decorations. The footage revealed something that challenged everything I thought I understood about the natural world. On a Tuesday evening in mid-August, I sat in the cemetery office reviewing the previous day's recordings. The camera angle provided a clear view of Mrs. Chen's grave, and I could see the white roses standing crisp and perfect in their bronze vase as of 6 in the morning. I fast-forwarded through the day's footage, watching visitors come and go, watching shadows shift as the sun moved across the sky. At exactly 6:15 in the evening, 15 minutes after I'd begun my evening prayers, in the chapel the transformation began. It started with a single rose near the center of the arrangement. One moment, the petals were pure white, and the next, darkness began spreading from the base of each petal outward, like ink dropped into water. The change was gradual but visible in real time, each petal darkening systematically until the entire bloom had turned black. Then the process moved to the next rose, and the next, working outward from the center in a pattern that seemed almost deliberate. The entire transformation took 11 minutes. 11 minutes during which I was in the chapel, conducting my evening prayers, completely unaware that something impossible was happening 100 yards away. When I reached the final Amen of my service, the last rose completed its change from white to black. I watched that footage 7 times, looking for any explanation that might make sense. Light anomalies, camera malfunction, digital artifacts. But the recording was clear and consistent. The roses were changing color through some process that occurred regularly, predictably, and in perfect timing with my evening prayers. The next evening, I positioned myself where I could see Mrs. Chen's grave during my prayer time. The white roses stood fresh and perfect in the late afternoon light. At 6 o'clock, I began my prayers, but kept my eyes focused on Section C. As I spoke the familiar words of evening devotion, I watched the roses begin their transformation. It was more disturbing to witness directly than it had been on the security footage. The darkness didn't just spread across the petals, it seemed to rise from somewhere deep within each bloom, as if the flowers were expressing something from their core. Something that needed to be black, needed to absorb light rather than reflect it. As I continued my prayers, rose after rose surrendered to that creeping darkness, until the entire arrangement stood like a shadow against the pale granite of Mrs. Chen's headstone. When my prayers ended, the transformation was complete. 24 white roses had become 24 black ones, not through any natural process I could name, but through something that responded to the rhythm of evening prayer, something that kept time with the sacred words I spoke each day at 6 o'clock. I never learned why Mrs. Chen's roses turned black, or what force connected their transformation to my evening prayers. The family continued their weekly visits throughout that summer and into the fall, always bringing white roses, never commenting on the black ones they removed. I continued my prayers, and the roses continued their impossible transformation, as regular and reliable as sunrise. Winter eventually ended the cycle, when the family switched to artificial arrangements that could withstand the cold. But I still think about those roses, about the way darkness would rise from within them, like some deep truth finally being expressed. Sometimes, during evening prayers, I find myself glancing toward section C, half expecting to see that familiar transformation beginning again. There are mysteries in this world that we're meant to witness rather than solve. And Mrs. Chen's roses taught me that some forms of devotion extend far beyond what the living can understand or control. Some ground just won't heal, no matter how much care you give it. My name is Eddie Martinez, and I've been groundskeeper at Restwood Cemetery for 11 years. It's honest work maintaining the grass, trimming around headstones, keeping the pathways clear for families who come to visit their loved ones. Most people think cemetery work would be depressing, but there's something peaceful about tending a place where people rest. The grounds tell you what they need if you know how to listen, and over the years, I've learned to read the subtle language of soil and stone. Restwood spans 42 acres of rolling hills on the outskirts of town, with sections dating back to the 1800s. The older areas have character-weathered marble angels, elaborate Victorian monuments, plots that have settled and shifted with more than a century of seasons. The newer sections are more uniform, with bronze markers set flush to the ground and carefully maintained turf that makes mowing easier. My daily routine takes me through all of it, checking sprinkler systems, treating problem areas, and keeping everything looking respectful for the families who visit. I work alone most days, starting at 6 in the morning when the dew is still heavy and the cemetery is quiet except for the occasional jogger using our pathways. By the time the office opens at 9 and visitors start arriving, I've usually covered the essential maintenance and moved on to project work reseeding bare spots, adjusting irrigation, or helping with new installations. It's methodical work that suits my temperament, and after 11 years, I know every square foot of these grounds. Plot 23G first caught my attention in the spring of 2023, during my routine inspection of Section J. This is one of our newer areas, developed in the 1990s with modern drainage and uniform spacing. The plots are clearly marked, the records are computerized, and everything should grow evenly with proper care. But Plot 23G was different from the start. The grass there never looked right. While the surrounding plots maintained the thick, healthy turf we pride ourselves on, 23G remained patchy and thin. Not completely bare there was grass, but it grew in irregular clusters separated by areas of brown, compacted earth. The pattern was distinctive, a perfect rectangle, exactly 6 feet by 3 feet, positioned precisely where a burial plot should be. I tried everything I could think of: extra water, fertilizer, aeration, reseeding with different grass varieties. I tested the soil pH, checked for drainage issues, even had the irrigation system inspected to make sure that section was getting adequate coverage. Nothing helped. The grass would sprout, grow for a few weeks, then yellow and die back, leaving those same brown patches in that same rectangular pattern. After 6 months of failed attempts, I decided to check the cemetery records. Maybe there was something about Plot 23G that I didn't know: an old burial that predated the computer system, or soil contamination from previous land use. The office manager, Mrs. Patterson, pulled up the digital files and the old paper records going back to when Section J was first developed. According to every record we had, Plot 23G had never been sold or used. It was listed as available inventory, with no burials, no services, no activity of any kind. As far as Restwood Cemetery's official records were concerned, that plot was empty ground that should grow grass like any other. But the earth itself told a different story. I started paying closer attention to the area around 23G. The plots immediately adjacent 23F and 23H were occupied and well-maintained, with healthy grass and regular flower arrangements from visiting families. But there was something about the ground between them that felt wrong, in a way I couldn't quite articulate. The soil seemed denser there, more settled, as if it had been disturbed and compacted by something heavy. In late fall, after the growing season ended and my maintenance schedule lightened, I decided to investigate more thoroughly. I brought a soil auger to test the ground composition at different depths, thinking I might find contamination or filled dirt that was preventing proper root development. What I found instead was evidence that someone had been digging in plot 23G long before I ever tried to plant grass there. The auger brought up soil samples that told a clear story. This ground had been excavated and backfilled, probably years ago. The soil layers were mixed and inconsistent, with patches of clay that didn't match the surrounding area and fragments of wood that looked like they came from construction lumber. Someone had dug a significant hole in plot 23G and filled it back in, but there was no record of any authorized work in that location. I should have reported my findings to Mrs. Patterson, should have followed proper procedures, and let the cemetery administration handle whatever irregularity I discovered. Instead, on a quiet Tuesday morning in early December, I brought a shovel to work and decided to find out what was buried in the plot that officially didn't exist. The digging went easier than it should have. The soil was loose and mixed, clearly backfill rather than undisturbed ground. 2 feet down, I hit something solid, a flat surface that felt like wood under my shovel blade. I expanded the hole, working carefully to expose what I'd found. It was a casket lid, plain pine construction, stained dark with moisture and age, positioned exactly where it should be if plot 23G contained a proper burial. But according to our records, no casket should exist there. No one was supposed to be buried in that plot. I should have stopped then. Should have covered everything back up and called the police or the cemetery director or someone with authority to handle whatever I'd uncovered. Instead, I kept digging around the edges of the casket, exposing more of its surface. That's when I found the scratches. They were carved deep into the wood on the inside of the lid-long, desperate gouges that could only have been made by fingernails. Someone trapped inside that casket had clawed at the wood, trying to get out. The scratches formed a chaotic pattern across the entire inner surface, some so deep they'd gone through the wood entirely, creating small holes that had let in dirt and moisture over the years. I knelt there in the bottom of that hole, looking at evidence of someone's final, desperate moments, and felt something cold settle in my chest. This wasn't just an unmarked grave or a record-keeping error. Someone had been buried alive in plot 23G, and their final acts had been recorded in those scratches on the casket lid. I ran my fingers over the deepest gouges, trying to understand what I was seeing. The wood was soft with rot, but the scratches were sharp and clear, preserved by the dry conditions inside the casket. In some places, I could see what looked like nail fragments still embedded in the wood. In others, dark stains that might have been blood had soaked into the grain. The scratches weren't random. As I studied them more closely, I realized they formed patterns, desperate attempts at letters, maybe, or numbers. Someone had tried to leave a message, carving it into their coffin lid with their dying strength. But the letters were incomplete, distorted by panic and failing light, impossible to read clearly. I sat in that hole for a long time, trying to decide what to do with what I'd found. The logical thing was to call the authorities, report the unmarked grave, and let proper investigations determine who was buried there and how they'd ended up in a plot with no records. But something about the scratches stopped me. They felt private, personal, final communication that wasn't meant for official reports or legal proceedings. Eventually, I filled the hole back in, covered the casket, packed the soil down, and restored the surface to match the surrounding area. I never told Mrs. Patterson or anyone else about what I'd found 3 feet below plot 23G. Some secrets, I decided, were meant to stay buried. But I think about those scratches often, especially when I'm working in Section J, and pass by that plot with its persistent brown patches. I wonder who was buried there without records or ceremony, and what their final moments were like in the darkness of that pine box. I wonder if the grass refuses to grow because some part of them is still trying to get out, still clawing upward toward air and light. The ground remembers what we try to forget, and sometimes the only way to honor that memory is to tend it quietly, without questions or explanations. Plot 23G will never grow proper grass, but I make sure to keep it neat and respectful. It's the least I can do for someone whose final resting place exists only in the testimony of fingernail scratches and dying grass. Some reflections have a will of their own. My name is Director Patricia Hartwell, and I've been managing Riverside Memorial Home for 9 years. It's demanding work that requires equal parts compassion and efficiency coordinating services, supporting grieving families, and ensuring that every detail of a person's final tribute reflects the dignity they deserve. The funeral home itself is a converted mansion from the 1920s, with original hardwood floors, crystal chandeliers, and the kind of architectural details that provide comfort to families during their most difficult moments. Viewing Room C has always been my favorite space in the building. It's smaller than our main chapel, but more intimate, with tall windows that let in soft natural light and an antique mirror that's been part of the room's furnishing since the home opened in 1947. The mirror is beautiful and ornate piece with a silver frame that's developed a gentle patina over the decades. It hangs on the wall opposite the casket area, positioned so that visitors can see themselves as they pay their respects, a final moment of shared presence with their loved one. My typical schedule involves arriving at 7:30 each morning, reviewing the day's services, and conducting a walkthrough of all our facilities to ensure everything is prepared for families. I usually leave by 6 in the evening, after the last visitors have departed and the building is secured for the night. It's a routine I've maintained for years, and one that provides structure during weeks that can be emotionally challenging for everyone involved. The first time my assistant Carol mentioned seeing me in Viewing Room C after hours, I assumed there had been some confusion about timing. It was a Monday morning in late September of 2024, and she was preparing the room for a service scheduled later that day. "I saw you in here around 8 o'clock last night," she said, adjusting the flower arrangements near the casket. "Standing right over there by the mirror." I waved, "But you seemed really focused on Mr. Peterson." I looked at her, confused. "Carol, I left the building at 5:30 yesterday. I was home having dinner with my husband by 8. She paused in her work, a slight frown crossing her face. "That's strange. I could have sworn it was you. Same height, same posture. You had your arms crossed the way you do when you're making sure everything looks perfect." I dismissed it as a case of mistaken identity, or perhaps fatigue affecting Carol's memory. We'd been busy that week, and long hours can play tricks on perception. But the comment stayed with me throughout the day, a small, nagging uncertainty that I couldn't quite shake. The second incident happened the following Monday. This time it was James, our night security guard, who mentioned seeing me during his evening rounds. "You were in Viewing Room C around 9:30, he said during our Tuesday morning briefing. "Door was locked, but I could see you through the glass. Figured you'd come back for something you forgot." Again, I explained that I'd been home all evening. Again, I was met with a confused look and the insistence that the person in the viewing room had certainly looked like me. James described my reflection in the antique mirror, standing with arms crossed, watching over the casket with the kind of protective attention I was known for. By the third week, when both Carol and James reported similar sightings on consecutive nights, I began to feel genuinely unsettled. I reviewed my own schedule carefully, checking calendar entries and asking my husband to confirm the times I'd arrived home each evening. There was no confusion. I was definitely not in the building during the times they claimed to have seen me, but their descriptions were too consistent to dismiss. Both mentioned the same posture, the same position near the mirror, the same sense that I was maintaining a vigil over whoever was laid out for viewing. The details were specific enough that they couldn't be simple mistakes or coincidences. I decided to review the security footage from Viewing Room C thinking it might resolve the mystery once and for all. What I saw in those recordings challenged everything I thought I understood about my own presence and awareness. The footage from the previous Monday showed exactly what Carol and James had described. At 8:17 p.m., a figure that looked unmistakably like me entered the frame near the antique mirror. The image quality wasn't perfect. The room's subdued lighting made details soft, but the silhouette, the posture, even the way the figure positioned itself near the casket, all matched my own mannerisms perfectly. I watched myself stand there for nearly 20 minutes, arms crossed, maintaining what appeared to be a protective watch over Mr. Peterson's casket. The figure never moved around the room, never adjusted anything, or performed any specific task. It simply stood there, reflected in the antique mirror, providing a presence that somehow seemed both comforting and necessary. The most disturbing part was that I had absolutely no memory of being there. I checked the footage from other nights when sightings had been reported. Each time, the same pattern appeared. My unmistakable form taking position near the mirror, maintaining a silent vigil over whoever was lying in state, always between 8 and 10 in the evening, always during times when I knew with certainty that I was elsewhere. The recordings showed me performing acts of care and attention that I would have wanted to perform, standing guard over people entrusted to our care in exactly the way my professional instincts would have guided me. But I had no conscious awareness of these visits, no memory of deciding to return to the funeral home, no recollection of unlocking doors or turning off alarm systems. I began paying closer attention to my own state of mind during evening hours. I found myself thinking more frequently about whoever was lying in viewing room C, wondering if they were receiving the respect and dignity they deserved, feeling a nagging sense that I should be there to ensure their comfort. These thoughts seemed to intensify around 8 o'clock each evening, creating a restless anxiety that I couldn't explain or dismiss. One Thursday night in mid-October, I decided to test what was happening by staying deliberately alert to my own actions and whereabouts. I positioned myself in my living room with a clear view of the clock, determined to remain conscious and present throughout the evening hours when these mysterious visits occurred. At 8:15, I found myself standing in viewing room C. The transition wasn't dramatic or supernatural in any obvious way. One moment I was sitting in my living room, completely aware of my surroundings, and the next moment I was standing beside the antique mirror, looking down at Mrs. Williams in her casket. There was no memory of driving to the funeral home, no recollection of unlocking the building or making the decision to come. I was simply there, as if I belonged there, as if I'd always been there. The strangest part was how natural it felt. Standing in that room, keeping watch over Mrs. Williams, seemed like the most normal and necessary thing in the world. I could see my reflection in the antique mirror, arms crossed in my characteristic posture, and felt a deep sense of rightness about my presence. This was where I was supposed to be. This was what I was meant to be doing. I maintained my vigil for exactly 19 minutes, then found myself back in my living room with no clear memory of the transition. My husband was reading in his chair, completely unaware that I'd left the house. According to the clock, it was 8:34. The next morning, James confirmed that he'd seen me in viewing room C at the usual time, maintaining the usual watch near the mirror. The security footage would later show my familiar silhouette taking its protective position, just as it had on so many previous nights. I never found an explanation for what was happening to me, or why some part of my consciousness felt compelled to maintain these evening vigils. The episodes continued throughout October and into November, always following the same pattern, an unconscious journey to viewing room C, a period of standing guard reflected in the antique mirror, and a return home with no memory of the experience. The phenomena ended when we temporarily closed viewing room C for renovations in late November. During the 3 weeks that room was unavailable, no staff members reported seeing me after hours, and I experienced no gaps in my evening awareness. When the room reopened in mid-December, the mysterious visits had stopped completely. But I still think about those weeks when something in me felt compelled to provide a presence and protection that went beyond conscious decision-making. The antique mirror was cleaned and polished during the renovation, its silver surface restored to perfect clarity. Sometimes, when I'm conducting my morning walkthrough of Viewing Room C, I catch sight of my reflection in that mirror and wonder if some part of me is still standing guard there, maintaining a vigil that exists beyond memory or intention. The dead, I've learned, sometimes require a kind of care that transcends our normal understanding of duty and presence. And sometimes, that care finds a way to provide itself, whether we remember offering it or not. Death has its own appointment schedule, and sometimes it calls ahead. My name is Joyce Brennan, and I've been coordinating funeral services at Hillside Memorial for 13 years. It's detail-oriented work that requires sensitivity, organization, and the ability to guide families through one of the most difficult times of their lives. Most of my day is spent on the phone discussing service options, coordinating with clergy and cemeteries, and ensuring that every element of a memorial service reflects what the family wants for their loved one. The funeral home operates on a schedule that's both predictable and entirely unpredictable. We maintain regular business hours for pre-planning consultations and general inquiries, but death doesn't respect office hours. I've taken calls at 2 in the morning from hospitals, at 6 in the evening from nursing homes, and during Sunday dinner from families who've just experienced a sudden loss. It's part of the job, and after 13 years, I've learned to shift seamlessly from my personal life to professional mode whenever the phone rings. My desk sits in the main office area, surrounded by filing cabinets full of service records and reference materials for everything from casket options to cemetery regulations. The phone system displays caller information when available, and I keep detailed logs of every conversation, names, dates, service preferences, and any special requests or concerns. It's methodical work that helps ensure nothing gets overlooked when families are depending on us to handle arrangements properly. Most of our calls follow predictable patterns. Hospital notifications arrive within hours of someone's passing, with basic information about the deceased and next of kin. Family members call with questions about service options or to schedule planning appointments. Clergy reach out to discuss memorial services or coordinate schedules. It's a network of communication that flows smoothly most of the time, connecting all the people who need to work together to honor someone's life and provide comfort to those they've left behind. The first unusual call came on a Tuesday morning in March of 2024. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, and when I answered, I heard a woman's voice that was remarkably calm and professional. "This is regarding services for Eleanor Walsh," the voice said. "She'll be passing this Thursday evening around 7:30. Natural causes, very peaceful. The family will want a traditional service with burial at Greenwood Cemetery." I paused, looking at my appointment schedule and client files. "I'm sorry, but I don't have any Eleanor Walsh in our system. Are you calling to pre-plan services?" "No," the voice replied with perfect certainty. "She'll pass Thursday evening. The family will contact you Friday morning. They'll request the oak casket with brass handles, white interior. Mrs. Walsh will be wearing her blue dress with the pearl necklace." Before I could ask any follow-up questions, the line went dead. I stared at the phone for a moment, then made a note in my call log. Unknown caller regarding Eleanor Walsh. Possible prank or confusion. On Friday morning, Margaret Walsh called to arrange services for her mother Eleanor, who had passed away Thursday evening around 7:30 from heart failure. She requested a traditional service with burial at Greenwood Cemetery, specifically asking about an oak casket with brass handles and white interior. When I asked about clothing preferences, she mentioned her mother's blue dress and pearl necklace without any prompting from me. I could have dismissed it as coincidence if it had happened only once. But the following Tuesday, the same number called again with similarly specific information about someone who was still alive at the time of the call. "Services for Robert Chen," the calm voice said. "He'll pass Saturday morning, probably around 9:15. Automobile accident on Highway 12 near the Miller Road intersection. The family will want cremation with a memorial service." This time I was more prepared. "Who is this? How do you have this information?" The family will contact you Saturday afternoon. The voice continued, ignoring my questions. Mr. Chen will be wearing a gray suit, white shirt, red tie. There'll be a wedding ring and a watch with a leather band. Again, the line went dead. Again, I made a note in my log, though this time with considerably more unease. I found myself checking local news throughout the week, half expecting to see a report about Robert Chen, half hoping the call had been some kind of elaborate hoax. Saturday afternoon, David Chen called to arrange cremation services for his father Robert, who had been killed that morning in a car accident on Highway 12 near Miller Road. The details matched the anonymous caller's information exactly, down to the clothing and jewelry that Robert had been wearing when the accident occurred. After the third call correctly predicted the death of Maria Santos, including the specific cause, location, and even the fact that she'd be found wearing her favorite gardening gloves, I stopped answering when that number appeared on my caller ID. But the calls kept coming, always on Tuesday mornings, always with the same calm, professional tone providing information that couldn't possibly be known in advance. I started keeping a separate log for these calls, documenting every detail and checking them against the actual deaths that followed. The accuracy was perfect and deeply disturbing. The caller knew not just when and how people would die, but specific details about their appearance, clothing, jewelry, and even their final activities. Details that should have been impossible to predict. The calls created a strange tension in my work routine. Tuesday mornings became a source of dread, knowing that the phone would ring and I'd be given advance notice of someone's death. I considered changing my schedule, asking someone else to handle Tuesday morning calls, but the number seemed to know when I was available. If I was out, the calls would come on Wednesday or Thursday instead. By summer, I had documented 17 accurate predictions. Each call followed the same pattern, a calm voice providing specific details about someone's impending death, followed by confirmation when the family contacted our funeral home exactly as predicted. I began to feel complicit in something I couldn't understand, as if my knowledge of these future deaths somehow connected me to the process in ways that made me deeply uncomfortable. The most disturbing call came in late July. This time, the voice provided information about someone I knew personally, Mrs. Henderson from my church, who was in perfect health as far as anyone knew. Services for Dorothy Henderson, the voice said. She'll pass Tuesday evening while reading in her garden. Very sudden, very peaceful. The family will want a simple service at the chapel. She'll be wearing her yellow sundress and her mother's wedding ring. I broke my usual pattern of silence. Please don't tell me this, I said. I know Mrs. Henderson. She's a good person. The service will be Thursday at 2 o'clock. The voice continued as if I hadn't spoken. Yellow roses for the flowers. She'd want yellow roses. I couldn't bring myself to call Mrs. Henderson or warn her family. What would I say? That I'd received a phone call predicting her death? That she should avoid her garden on Tuesday evening? The situation felt impossible, caught between knowledge I didn't want and responsibility I couldn't define. Tuesday evening, Dorothy Henderson passed away peacefully while reading in her garden, exactly as predicted. Her daughter called Wednesday morning to arrange services, requesting a simple chapel ceremony with yellow roses. Mrs. Henderson had been wearing her yellow sundress and her mother's wedding ring when she was found. Standing in Mrs. Henderson's kitchen 2 days later, helping her daughter coordinate details for the service, I felt the full weight of what these calls meant. I wasn't just receiving advance notice of deaths. I was being prepared to serve families during their time of need with information I shouldn't have had. The caller wasn't just predicting future events. They were ensuring that I could provide exactly the right kind of support when bereaved families reached out. The calls continued through the fall, always accurate, always professional, always providing details that helped me serve families with unusual sensitivity and preparation. I stopped trying to avoid them and started taking careful notes, recognizing that whatever force was behind these communications was using me as part of a larger process of care and support. I never learned who was calling or how they obtained their information. The number never appeared in reverse directories or phone company records. The voice never varied in tone or provided any personal details about themselves. They simply called, provided information about future deaths, and trusted me to use that knowledge appropriately when the time came. The last call came in December, just before I decided to retire early and leave the funeral industry entirely. This time, the voice provided information about my own replacement, describing in detail how she would handle the transition and continue the work I'd been doing. I still think about those Tuesday morning calls and wonder if they've resumed with my successor. Death, I learned, has its own systems of communication and preparation, and sometimes it recruits the living to help ensure that final farewells are handled with the care and dignity that everyone deserves. The phone may still be ringing on Tuesday mornings, and somewhere, someone is taking notes about appointments they didn't make. Some things insist on staying crooked, no matter how many times you try to set them right. My name is Tommy Velasco, and I've been working the night shift at Meridian Funeral Home for 6 years. It's solitary work that suits my temperament, preparing bodies for viewing, maintaining equipment, and handling the deliveries that come in after regular business hours. Most people think embalming would be unsettling work, but there's something peaceful about it. The quiet concentration required, the sense of providing dignity and care for people during their final transition. It's important work that helps families say goodbye with comfort and grace. The funeral home operates around the clock, though the pace changes dramatically after 5 p.m. During business hours, the building hums with activity consultations with families, coordination of services, staff preparing for viewings and ceremonies. But once the last visitor leaves and the office staff goes home, the building settles into a different rhythm. That's when I arrive, usually around 7, to handle the evening's preparation work and any late deliveries that come in from hospitals or transport services. My workspace is in the basement preparation room, a climate-controlled area with stainless steel tables, professional lighting, and all the equipment necessary for restoration and preservation work. It's connected to the loading dock by a service elevator that allows me to move caskets and equipment efficiently between floors. The loading dock itself is accessible from the alley behind the building, designed for discreet deliveries that won't disturb families or neighbors during sensitive times. Most of our deliveries arrive during regular business hours, but emergency situations and hospital schedules sometimes require after-hours service. I'm equipped to handle everything receiving caskets from manufacturers, accepting transfers from other funeral homes, and processing bodies from medical facilities that operate their own transportation. Each delivery comes with detailed paperwork specifying the contents, destination, and any special instructions for handling or preparation. The pattern I noticed started during my 3rd year on the night shift, sometime in the fall of 2022. It was subtle at first, just an observation that caskets delivered after 11 p.m. seemed to arrive with their nameplates slightly tilted. Not dramatically crooked, just askew enough to be noticeable to someone who paid attention to details. Since proper presentation is crucial in funeral service, I would always straighten them before moving the caskets to their designated areas. The nameplates are usually attached during manufacturing, secured with small screws or adhesive mounting systems that shouldn't shift during normal transport. They're designed to remain perfectly level and clearly readable, providing essential identification for funeral home staff and family members. When I first noticed the tilting pattern, I assumed it was related to rough handling during transport or vibration from delivery vehicles traveling over uneven roads. I started documenting the anomaly in my nightly reports, noting which deliveries arrived with crooked nameplates and making sure to correct them before the day shift arrived. It seemed like a minor issue that could be resolved by working with our transport partners to improve their handling procedures. But as weeks passed, I realized the problem was more consistent and puzzling than I'd initially thought. Every single casket that arrived after 11 p.m. had a tilted nameplate. Every single one. Whether the delivery came from across town or across the state, whether it was transported by our regular partners or unfamiliar services, the result was always the same. The nameplate would be angled just enough to make the name difficult to read clearly, tilted left or right, with no apparent pattern to the direction. What made it even stranger was that caskets delivered before 11 p.m. never had this problem. A delivery at 10:50 would arrive with a perfectly straight nameplate. A delivery at 11:10 would arrive crooked. The timing seemed to matter more than the transport method, the distance traveled, or the handling procedures used by different drivers. I began paying closer attention to the straightening process, using a small level to ensure perfect alignment and checking the mounting hardware to make sure everything was secure. I would complete the adjustment, document it in my report, and move on to other tasks. But when I returned to work the following evening, caskets that I'd straightened the night before would be crooked again, not in the same direction, but tilted the opposite way, as if something had deliberately adjusted them after I'd left. This reverse tilting happened only with caskets I'd received and corrected during late-night hours. Morning deliveries handled by the day shift remained properly aligned. Only the after 11 arrivals seemed to insist on maintaining their crooked nameplates, resisting my attempts at correction and somehow adjusting themselves back to an improper angle during the day. I started experimenting with different approaches. I tried using stronger adhesive to secure loose nameplates, tightening screws that seemed properly secured, and even replacing mounting hardware that appeared to be functioning correctly. Nothing worked. The nameplates would be perfectly straight when I finished my adjustments, and tilted again when I returned the next evening. By my 4th year, I'd documented over 200 instances of this pattern. Late-night deliveries arrived crooked, I straightened them, and they became crooked again in the opposite direction. It happened with wooden caskets and metal ones, with expensive models and basic ones, with deliveries from established funeral homes and new transport services. The only consistent factor was the timing after 11 p.m. The nameplates insisted on being askew. I mentioned the phenomenon to David, the day shift supervisor, thinking maybe someone on his team was adjusting the nameplates for reasons I didn't understand. He looked at me with genuine confusion and assured me that no one touched the caskets I'd prepared unless there was a specific need for additional work or family consultation. "We don't really look at the nameplates that closely," he said. "As long as the casket is properly positioned and prepared for viewing, we focus on other details. Are you sure they're moving on their own?" I was sure. I'd been documenting everything carefully, including photographs that showed the nameplates straight after my adjustments, and crooked again the following evening. The evidence was clear, but the explanation remained elusive. One Thursday night in October of 2024, I decided to test what would happen if I didn't straighten a newly arrived nameplate. The delivery had come in at 11:30, a mahogany casket with brass handles and a nameplate that was tilted about 15 degrees to the left, making the name Harold Winters barely readable. Instead of correcting it immediately, I left it exactly as it had arrived and continued with my other work. The next evening, the nameplate was still tilted 15 degrees to the left. It hadn't moved at all during the day, hadn't shifted to the opposite direction like the others I'd straightened. For the first time in over 2 years, a late-night delivery nameplate had remained exactly as it was positioned when it arrived. I tried the same approach with the next several late deliveries. Each time I left the nameplate uncorrected, it stayed in its original crooked position. Only when I straightened them did they shift to the opposite direction during the day. Something about my intervention was triggering the reverse movement, as if the nameplates needed to be askew and would adjust themselves to maintain that condition if I tried to correct them. I realized that the crooked nameplates weren't a problem to be solved, they were a requirement of some kind. Something about the late-night hours demanded that the names remain difficult to read, the identities partially obscured. My attempts to provide proper presentation and clear identification were working against a force that preferred anonymity during certain hours. The discovery changed how I approached my work. I stopped straightening the late delivery nameplates, letting them remain in whatever position they'd arrived in. The constant cycle of correction and reverse tilting ended, replaced by a stable pattern of deliberate crookedness that seemed to satisfy whatever was causing the phenomenon. But the implications of that pattern stayed with me. During the daylight hours, when families visited and services were conducted, the nameplates would mysteriously straighten themselves, allowing proper identification and respectful presentation. Only during the deep night hours, when I was alone with the bodies in my care, did the names insist on remaining partially hidden. I never learned why this happened, or what force was behind the nameplate adjustments. I simply accepted that some aspects of working with the dead involve accommodating preferences and requirements that don't align with normal expectations. The late-night hours have their own rules, and after 6 years of working those shifts, I've learned that fighting those rules only creates more disturbance. Now I focus on the aspects of my work that I can control: proper preparation, respectful handling, and ensuring that families receive the dignity and care they deserve. The nameplates tilt themselves according to some schedule I don't understand, and I've made peace with that mystery. Some things I've learned insist on staying crooked, and sometimes the most professional thing you can do is let them be. Sometimes the dead have opinions about what should accompany them into eternity. My name is Director Elena Rodriguez, and I've been managing Westside Memorial Chapel for 7 years. It's work that requires both professional expertise and deep sensitivity to family needs during their most difficult moments. Every detail matters when you're helping people say goodbye to someone they love, and I've learned that honoring personal requests and family traditions often provides the greatest comfort during the grieving process. The chapel itself is a converted Victorian home with warm wood paneling, stained glass windows, and 3 viewing rooms that can accommodate services of different sizes. My office overlooks the main parlor, where we conduct most of our services, and I make it a point to walk through all our facilities several times each day to ensure everything maintains the dignity and peacefulness that families deserve. Most families have specific wishes about how their loved one should be presented and what personal items should be included with the viewing or burial. Wedding rings, religious medals, favorite pieces of jewelry, sometimes small mementos that held special meaning. I've accommodated requests for everything from military insignia to handwritten letters, and I consider these personal touches an essential part of helping families create a meaningful farewell. Mrs. Patterson contacted us on a Monday morning in October of 2024 to arrange services for her husband Robert, who had passed away over the weekend after a brief illness. She was a composed, thoughtful woman who had clearly given careful consideration to how she wanted to honor her husband's memory. During our consultation, she made one request that was unusual but not unprecedented. "I'd like to place his favorite family photograph in the casket with him," she said, showing me a framed 5x7 picture of herself, Robert, and their 2 adult children taken during a summer vacation several years earlier. He kept this on his nightstand and looked at it every morning when he woke up. I think he'd want it with him. I explained that including personal items in the casket was certainly possible, and that many families found comfort in sending meaningful objects with their loved one. The photograph was a reasonable size and wouldn't interfere with the viewing or burial process. Mrs. Patterson seemed relieved that we could accommodate her request. Robert Patterson was scheduled for a 3-day viewing period before burial on Thursday morning. The photograph was to be positioned near his hands, where it would be visible to family members during their visits, but secure enough not to shift during the viewing period. I personally supervised the placement on Monday evening, ensuring that the frame was properly positioned and the image clearly visible. When I conducted my Tuesday morning walkthrough before the chapel opened to visitors, I found the photograph face down beside Robert's hands. The frame hadn't fallen or shifted due to vibration or settling. It had been deliberately turned over, as if someone had reached into the casket and flipped it during the night. I assumed one of our staff members had accidentally disturbed it during evening cleaning or maintenance. I carefully repositioned the photograph face up, checked that it was secure, and made a note to remind the staff about being careful around personal items. When Mrs. Patterson and her family arrived for their first viewing session, the photograph was properly displayed as requested. That evening, I stayed late to complete some administrative work and decided to check on the viewing rooms before leaving. The photograph was still face up at 7 p.m. when I completed my rounds. But when I arrived Wednesday morning, it was face down again, turned over with the same deliberate precision as the day before. This time I questioned the night cleaning staff and security personnel. No one had entered the viewing room after 7 p.m., and our security cameras showed no activity in that area overnight. The cleaning staff confirmed they had strict instructions never to touch personal items in the caskets, and they insisted they hadn't been near Robert's viewing area. I repositioned the photograph again, this time placing it slightly differently and making sure it was completely secure in its frame. Throughout Wednesday, during family visits and viewing hours, it remained properly positioned. Mrs. Properly Positioned Patterson commented on how much it meant to her to see her husband with his favorite picture, and I was glad we could provide that comfort. Wednesday evening, I conducted my final walkthrough at 8:30 p.m. The photograph was face up and properly positioned. Thursday morning, it was face down again. 3 nights in a row, the photograph had been turned over during hours when no one should have been in the viewing room. The pattern was too consistent to be accidental and too specific to be explained by settling or vibration. Something was deliberately flipping that photograph face down every night. I began to consider the possibility that Robert himself was somehow involved in moving the picture. The idea seemed impossible, but I'd been in funeral service long enough to witness things that challenged conventional understanding. Occasionally, families reported phenomena that suggested their loved ones were somehow still present or aware during the viewing period. As I prepared for Robert's burial service Thursday morning, I faced a decision about the photograph. Mrs. Patterson had specifically requested that it be buried with her husband, and she would expect to see it properly positioned when she arrived for the final viewing before burial. But 3 consecutive nights of the picture being turned face down suggested that Robert might have different preferences about how he wanted to be remembered or what he wanted to take with him. I stood beside Robert's casket that Thursday morning, holding the photograph and trying to decide what would be most respectful to everyone involved. Mrs. Patterson's wishes were clear and understandable, but the consistent overnight pattern suggested that Robert might be trying to communicate something about the photograph's placement. When Mrs. Patterson arrived with her family for the final viewing, I explained what had been happening with the photograph over the previous 3 nights. I told her about finding it face down each morning despite careful positioning the evening before, and about the lack of any reasonable explanation for the repeated movement. She listened quietly, her expression thoughtful rather than skeptical. After a long moment, she said, "Robert was always very private about his emotions. He loved us deeply, but he wasn't comfortable with displays of sentiment. Maybe he doesn't want to be seen holding the picture where everyone can see it." I offered to position the photograph differently, perhaps tucked beside him rather than displayed prominently or placed in the casket in a way that would be more discreet, but Mrs. Patterson shook her head. "If he's been turning it face down every night, maybe that's how he wants it," she said. "Maybe he wants the picture with him, but he wants it private, just for him." So that's what we did. For the final viewing and burial, I placed the photograph face down beside Robert's hands, respecting what appeared to be his preference while still honoring Mrs. Patterson's wish that it accompany him. The family seemed to find peace in the arrangement, understanding that love could be expressed through privacy as well as display. The photograph stayed face down throughout that final day, from the morning viewing through the burial service. There was no overnight period for it to move, no mysterious turning or repositioning. It remained exactly as we had placed it, suggesting that the previous 3 nights of movement had been leading to this arrangement. I never experienced anything similar with other families or other personal items, and I never found an explanation for why Robert's photograph insisted on being turned face down each night. But the experience taught me that respect for the dead sometimes means honoring preferences we don't fully understand, communicated through means we can't easily explain. Love, I learned, can be private as well as public, and sometimes the most meaningful gesture is the one that's kept hidden from view. Some equipment runs on principles that have nothing to do with mechanics. My name is Carl Hendricks, and I've been maintaining refrigeration systems at County General Hospital for 12 years. It's technical work that requires precision, attention to detail, and the ability to troubleshoot complex mechanical problems under pressure. When a cooler fails in the morgue or a freezer malfunctions in the pharmacy, people depend on me to restore proper function quickly and reliably. The hospital operates a comprehensive morgue facility in the basement, with 8 individual cooling units designed to maintain bodies at 38 degrees Fahrenheit. Each unit is equipped with digital temperature controls, backup systems, and monitoring alarms that alert staff if conditions deviate from acceptable ranges. It's a straightforward setup that I've worked with for over a decade, and I know every component, every circuit, and every potential failure point in the system. My maintenance routine includes daily temperature checks, weekly system inspections, and monthly preventive service on all cooling equipment. I keep detailed logs of every reading, every adjustment, and every repair, both for compliance purposes and to track patterns that might indicate developing problems. The morgue units are critical infrastructure that can't afford to fail, so I maintain them with the same attention I'd give to life support systems in the ICU. Most of the cooling units perform exactly as designed, maintaining steady temperatures within a degree or two of the target setting. When problems develop, they usually follow predictable patterns: compressor wear, thermostat drift, seal degradation, or refrigerant leaks. I can diagnose and repair most issues within hours, restoring proper function and documenting the work for my supervisors and the hospital's compliance records. Unit 7 has always been different. I first noticed the temperature variance during my second month on the job, back in 2012. While Units 1 through 6 maintained steady readings at 38 degrees, Unit 7 consistently ran at 42 degrees, exactly 4 degrees warmer than the setting. Despite identical equipment and installation, I assumed it was a simple calibration issue and adjusted the thermostat to compensate. The next day, Unit 7 was running at 42 degrees again. I recalibrated the thermostat, checked the temperature sensors, and tested the control circuits. Everything appeared to be functioning normally, but the unit continued to operate 4 degrees above the intended temperature. I replaced the thermostat entirely, thinking the original might be defective. Unit 7 maintained its 42-degree temperature with the new thermostat, just as it had with the old one. The replacement equipment functioned perfectly. It simply functioned at a temperature 4 degrees higher than what I set it to maintain, as if the unit had its own opinion about what constituted proper cooling for its contents. Over the following months, I tried everything I could think of. I replaced temperature sensors, rebuilt the control system, checked refrigerant levels, tested compressor function, and inspected every component that could affect cooling performance. Multiple times, I completely overhauled Unit 7's systems, installing new parts and verifying proper installation. Nothing changed the basic pattern: 42 degrees, exactly 4 degrees warmer than the setting. The strangest part was that the temperature variance didn't cause any problems. Bodies stored in Unit 7 showed no signs of accelerated decomposition or deterioration. If anything, they seemed better preserved than bodies in the other units, more natural in appearance, more peaceful in expression. The pathologists never complained about condition issues with Unit 7 contents, and families who viewed bodies stored there often commented on how comfortable their loved ones looked. I started documenting the phenomenon more carefully, keeping separate logs for Unit 7 and noting any patterns or anomalies beyond the temperature variance. What I discovered was that the unit seemed to self-regulate in ways that defied mechanical explanation. When I set the thermostat to 34 degrees, trying to compensate for the 4-degree drift, the unit would operate at 38 degrees. When I set it to 40 degrees, expecting the usual variance, it would run at 44 degrees. The 4-degree difference was constant and consistent, regardless of ambient temperature, electrical load, or mechanical adjustments. Unit 7 operated exactly 4 degrees warmer than whatever temperature I programmed, as if it was adding its own correction factor to every setting. Management noticed the unusual maintenance frequency for Unit 7 and asked me to explain why I was spending so much time and resources on a single cooling unit. I provided detailed reports documenting the temperature variance and my attempts to correct it, recommending that we bring in outside consultants to evaluate the equipment. The first consultant arrived in March of 2014, a refrigeration specialist with 30 years of experience in hospital systems. He spent 2 days examining Unit 7, testing every component and comparing it to the other cooling units in the morgue. His report confirmed everything I'd already documented. The equipment was functioning perfectly, but maintaining a temperature 4 degrees higher than the programmed setting. Mechanically, there's nothing wrong with this unit, he told me. Every component tests within normal parameters. I can't explain why it runs warm, but it's not causing any functional problems. Maybe you should just accept that it operates at 42 degrees and set the thermostat accordingly. But accepting the anomaly felt like admitting defeat, like failing in my responsibility to maintain proper equipment function. I continued troubleshooting, bringing in 2 more consultants over the following year. Both reached the same conclusion. Unit 7 worked perfectly. It just worked 4 degrees warmer than it should. By 2015, I'd stopped trying to fix the temperature variance and started focusing on understanding it. I began paying closer attention to which bodies were stored in Unit 7 and whether there were patterns in how the unit was used. What I noticed was that families often specifically requested to view loved ones who had been stored in Unit 7, commenting on how peaceful and natural they appeared. The morgue staff, almost without conscious decision, began placing certain bodies in Unit 7 elderly patients who had died peacefully, accident victims who needed to look their best for family viewing, anyone where appearance and dignity were particularly important. They never formally discussed this practice, but over time Unit 7 became the preferred storage for cases requiring the most careful preservation. I realized that the 4-degree temperature variance wasn't a malfunction, it was a feature. Unit 7 had somehow calibrated itself to provide optimal conditions for the specific type of care the morgue staff needed to provide. The warmer temperature didn't accelerate decomposition because the unit was maintaining exactly the right conditions for its contents, conditions that happened to be 4 degrees warmer than the standard setting. During a particularly busy week in November of 2016, all 8 cooling units were occupied, and I needed to perform routine maintenance on Unit 3. I temporarily moved its contents to Unit 7, which already held 1 body. For the first time in 4 years, Unit 7 was storing 2 bodies instead of 1. The temperature dropped to 38 degrees exactly. With 2 bodies, Unit 7 operated at the standard temperature setting. With 1 body, it maintained the 4-degree variance. The unit was somehow adjusting its cooling based on occupancy, providing warmer conditions when housing a single body, and standard cooling when storing multiple bodies. It was regulating temperature based on the needs of its contents rather than the settings on the thermostat. I stopped questioning Unit 7's temperature variance after that. I documented its performance in my reports, noted that it consistently operated 4 degrees above setting when storing single bodies, and recommended that management accept this as normal operation. The consultants had confirmed that nothing was mechanically wrong, and the unit was clearly providing superior preservation under its preferred conditions. My maintenance logs now show Unit 7 as operating within acceptable parameters at 42 degrees single occupancy. I check it daily, clean it weekly, and service it monthly, just like the other units. But I no longer try to fix the temperature variance, because I understand that it's not broken. Some equipment, I've learned, knows better than its operators what conditions are needed for optimal performance. Unit 7 has been teaching me for 12 years that proper maintenance sometimes means accepting that machines can be smarter than their specifications, especially when they're caring for people who deserve the most comfortable conditions possible during their final stay. Some signatures write themselves when no one is watching. My name is Helen Crawford, and I've been the receptionist at Pine Valley Memorial Home for 9 years. It's quiet, steady work that involves greeting families, coordinating schedules, and managing the small but important details that help people navigate their most difficult days. I handle everything from answering phones to maintaining guest registers, ensuring that every family feels welcomed and supported during their time of grief. The funeral home sits on a tree-lined street in what used to be the residential heart of town, a renovated colonial house with wide front steps and tall windows that let in gentle, natural light. My desk occupies the front foyer, positioned so I can see everyone who enters and ensure that visitors feel acknowledged and directed to the appropriate services. It's a role that requires both professionalism and warmth, helping people feel comfortable during emotionally challenging moments. Part of my daily routine involves setting up condolence books for each service we're hosting. These are bound volumes where visitors can sign their names and leave messages for grieving families, creating a permanent record of who attended and what comfort they offered. I place a fresh book in each viewing room before services begin, positioned on a small table with elegant pens and sometimes a simple flower arrangement. The condolence books serve multiple purposes beyond just recording attendance. They provide families with a meaningful keepsake that documents the support they received, and they offer visitors a way to express sentiments that might be difficult to speak aloud. I've seen people spend considerable time writing thoughtful messages, sharing memories, or simply expressing their sympathy in words that bring comfort to those they're meant to support. At the end of each service, I collect the condolence books and present them to the families, usually along with any cards or other mementos that were left. It's one of the small ways we help preserve the memory of how a community came together to honor someone's life and support those who mourn their passing. I first noticed the unusual signature in late spring of 2023 during a service for Mrs. Elizabeth Morrison. While reviewing the condolence book before presenting it to her family, I saw an entry that caught my attention. "Thank you for your service, M.E.," written in beautiful copperplate handwriting near the middle of the book. The penmanship was distinctive, formal, precise, and executed with a kind of skill that suggested considerable practice or training. I didn't recognize the initials M.E. from our guest list, or from the people I'd seen attending Mrs. Morrison's service. The signature appeared between entries from family members I knew, positioned as if someone had signed the book during the main viewing hours. But I couldn't recall anyone with those initials being present, and the formal handwriting style seemed unusual for a typical condolence entry. The following week, during a service for Mr. James Chen, I found the same signature in that condolence book. "Thank you for your service, M.E.," in identical copperplate handwriting. This time, I paid closer attention to the positioning and timing, noting that the signature appeared between entries that I could match to specific visitors I'd observed throughout the day. Again, I had no memory of anyone with the initials M.E. attending Mr. Chen's service. I began to wonder if someone was visiting during hours when I was away from my desk, perhaps during breaks or when I was assisting families in other parts of the building. But our services are usually well attended, and it seemed unlikely that someone could sign the book without being noticed by other visitors or family members. By midsummer, I'd found the M.E. signature in every condolence book we'd used. Always the same message, always the same elegant handwriting, always positioned among entries from verified attendees. The consistency was remarkable, just in the words and penmanship, but in the way the signature appeared to belong naturally among the other entries, as if M.E. was a regular and expected participant in every service. I started keeping the condolence books more secure, bringing them to my desk during breaks, and storing them in locked cabinets overnight. I thought this might prevent unauthorized access and help me identify when and how the mysterious signature was being added. But the signatures continued to appear, even when the books had been locked away, during all non-service hours. The most unsettling discovery came during a particularly busy Thursday, when we were hosting 2 services simultaneously in different viewing rooms. I had placed fresh condolence books in both rooms at the same time, monitored both services throughout the day, and collected both books at the end of the evening. Each book contained the M.E. signature, written in identical handwriting, and positioned among entries that I could verify had been made during the actual service hours. The timing made it clear that if a living person was making these entries, they would have had to be in 2 places at once, signing both books during overlapping time periods, while somehow remaining invisible to me and to other attendees. The alternative explanation that the signatures were appearing through some non-physical means seemed impossible but increasingly difficult to dismiss. I began paying closer attention to the actual message. "Thank you for your service, The phrase suggested gratitude toward the deceased, but it was formal and somewhat ambiguous. It could refer to military service, professional contribution, community involvement, or simply the service of living a meaningful life. The message was appropriate for any type of memorial, generic enough to fit every situation we encountered. During a quiet moment in September, I decided to research the signature more thoroughly. I examined the handwriting style, comparing it to historical examples of copperplate penmanship, and looking for distinctive characteristics that might provide clues about the writer's identity or background. The style was classic 19th century formal script, executed with the kind of precision that suggested extensive training or long practice. I also began documenting exactly when and where the signatures appeared, creating a detailed log of every instance. What I discovered was that the ME entries always appeared in chronological order, with the other signatures positioned appropriately within the flow of entries from actual attendees. They never appeared at the beginning or end of the book, never seemed obviously inserted after the fact. One evening in late October, I decided to test whether the signature would appear if I maintained constant observation of the condolence book. During a service for Mrs. Patricia Williams, I positioned myself where I could see the signing table throughout the entire viewing period, taking breaks only when other staff members could maintain watch. I documented every person who approached the book and verified that their entries appeared as expected. At the end of the service, when I collected the book for presentation to the Williams family, the ME signature was there. Between entries from Mrs. Williams' daughter and her neighbor, written in the same elegant copperplate handwriting, was "Thank you for your service, M.E." I had watched the book continuously, documented every signature, and confirmed that no one with those initials had attended the service. Standing in that viewing room, holding a condolence book that contained a signature I had watched not being written, I felt the full weight of what I was dealing with. The M.E. entries weren't being made by any living person who attended our services. They were appearing through some means that operated beyond normal observation, creating a permanent record of presence without any visible manifestation of that presence. I stopped mentioning the mysterious signatures to families when I presented their condolence books. The messages were appropriate and respectful, and the elegant handwriting added a touch of dignity to the collections. If Emmy was someone who felt compelled to acknowledge every person we honored, regardless of how they managed to sign books they never physically touched, their gratitude seemed sincere and their respect genuine. The signatures continue to appear in every condolence book we use. I've accepted that M.E. is a consistent participant in our services, someone who finds a way to acknowledge each person we honor with gratitude for their service to life, family, and community. I don't understand how the signatures appear, but I've learned to appreciate the consistency of that presence and the comfort it might provide to families who review their books later. Sometimes, when I'm setting up for a new service, I find myself wondering what M.E. looks like, whether they stand quietly in the back during ceremonies, whether they know that I've noticed their faithful attendance. But then I remember that some forms of presence don't require physical form, and some expressions of gratitude transcend the normal boundaries of how we acknowledge and remember the dead.